Being here, Williams, to answer the questions for us, and thank you, DP, for holding this. It's a long question, but it's for both sides. So, how many compressor stations are operating in Susquehanna County? How many compressor stations are planned or permitted in Susquehanna County? And were you aware that no foam trucks to fight gas hole fires exist in Susquehanna County, and that Lackawanna County had to bring theirs, and it took an hour and a half to arrive? And is Williams and the industry planning to purchase and make available these assets to local emergency responders so as not to put our first responders in danger?
Sure. I guess the first thing is on a gas fire like we had, the best way to extinguish those is just to allow that fuel source to go away or extinguish itself. You know, on a fire like that, we don't want to go in and put out the fire while you still have gas escaping, because you create another opportunity for an explosion. Once we know that once it is ignited, it's a safer environment than if it was extinguished. So we really let the fire extinguish itself with its own fuel. Then the foam truck was actually what we felt like was the best way to extinguish the lube oil fire. And we had a meeting last night with the emergency responders of the Springville Fire Department, and we had a kind of a review of the event. And following that, Preston and I had a little discussion around what kind of equipment that might need and require, and we're going to continue to discuss with them and understand what their needs might be, and see how we can, what kind of relationship we need to have, and how do we kind of work with them over the next few months, and et cetera, to see kind of what kind of equipment makes sense, and work with them on that. But we aren't committed to doing anything specific at this point, but I just know Preston and I had a conversation on it, and it's something we'll continue to have discussions with them.
Okay, thank you.
I understand that the explosion occurred, from what you're saying, at 11:40 in the late morning, and then 1 o'clock a voicemail was sent to DEP. So I'd like to know why it took so long, and is that within regulations? If an explosion occurred at 11:40, that it took over an hour and 20 minutes to notify DEP that you had a serious situation. So I'd like to know why.
He's not necessarily one of the first responders to an incident like that. And so our initial concern from a notification standpoint is working with the first responders, getting the incident command set up, and get all of those things from an emergency management standpoint in place. And so once those were accomplished, we did proceed with making some of the other notifications that were relevant to those important stakeholders. And so once we started making those touch points, that's when we notified the DEP and some of the other folks that were on that threshold.
Verify if I can add to that.
Would you be able to add to that?
Sure.
Is that within regulation for you? Are you satisfied with that?
Yes, there's no specific there may be other parts of our regulations and the vast things that DEP regulates where we have a specific notification. For example, I think in drinking water systems, there are specific regulations that say you must notify us within 1 hour. There's no such specific regulation here. In my experience is, just as Mike described, is that we feel that the notice in this case was sufficient. It's about what we expected or we would typically see. If this were a different scenario, if it was an uncontrolled pollution event, for example, we may have expected quicker notice. But based on the circumstances as we know it now, we think the notice was sufficient. And DEP's role in response in these kinds of situations is, as Mike said, we are not a first responder. We will respond. Sometimes we respond at the request of the emergency management agency that would like DEP on site to do air quality monitoring or collect samples and the environmental samples. So from the notification standpoint, we think it was about right in this case.
So if I have more questions, I have to come back, is that
Yeah,
it?
let's go.
So
Then we have other people, so I can come back.
Yeah.
Please, yeah, hopefully we can get.
From what I understand, this station is what's known as a synthetic miner, so you use certain technologies to keep it below major source thresholds. Sort of a question in a statement, but the real question is, how can DEP or has DEP verified that this incident did not break the terms of the air quality permits, such as how can they verify that it did not trip major source status or exceed visible emissions limitations?
The emissions data, we did get some emissions related to the venting of the gas, and it was basically minimal to greenhouse gas. You know, it was basically methane, so that was related to the greenhouse gas rule. We did a quick calculation and came up with some numbers that wouldn't take it over the threshold of the 100,000 ton threshold. The fire, you know, we didn't quantify those emissions. Visible emissions, we checked with our operations program, and typically we don't look at visible emissions excursions unless it's going through a stack, or this was just more of a, something like this could be related to fugitive emissions, but you know, normally when there's an accident and related to a fire, that's something that we usually don't address.
Doesn't GP5 permit and a minor source plan approval require like an opacity, like a 30% opacity?
Right, that's on the sources that are permitted, the engines. The 10% and 30% opacity is related to the stack emissions from the engines, not from a fire or anything else on the site.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
I'll start the first, I'm going to take your last part, and then I'm going to have Mark talk a little bit about the monitors. What I was referring to when I mentioned earlier about portable emissions monitors, that's referred to as there's a requirement that these units, the air compressor units and the air pollution control device, go through what's called a stack test, where we actually operate the engines under conditions, and we test the emissions that are coming out to make sure that they're within limits. And there's a couple of kinds of stack tests. One is, in this case, they were portable analyzers. They're certified. They don't do the full range of stack testing parameters. They do NOx and CO. So that's what was used by Williams in the days, I think it was April 3rd, 4th, and 5th, those 3 days. And for the rest of the question, in terms of, so when we were there on site the day of the incident, by the time we arrived, as I said, it was about 4 o'clock. The fire was just about out. It was smoldering at that point. Our staff, our emergency responder, had the same kind of portable air monitor that Williams was using. At that point, he just observed what Williams was doing, asked the EMA if they perceived a need for any additional air monitoring. The answer to that was no. And it was because by that time, the fire was kind of short-lived, and by the time we were there, everything was out or significantly under control. As in terms of what monitoring routinely happens at this station, Mark's going to address that.
Right, I can elaborate a little bit on the stack testing too. Sure. On sources like this, and there's small, minor facilities and not major, they do either annual testing, something every 3 months. They're required to do 3 months testing plus once every 8,760 hours. But when they're doing the testing, they also monitor certain parameters, and it's called parametric monitoring, which is, Mike mentioned earlier, temperature and pressure across the oxidation catalyst. So when you're doing the stack test and showing compliance, you're also measuring those parameters. So, because you're only stack testing once every 3 months to a year, so in between those times, people ask, well, how do you know they're in compliance? Well, we monitor these parameters, temperature and pressure drop. As long as they stay in this certain range that was shown in compliance during the test, then it assures compliance with the emission standards. Larger facilities have continuous emission monitors, which is, you're talking large coal-fired power plants, things like that, and they measure continuously, but, they're only on major sources, and because they're very expensive, and Harrisburg's involved in that. But the monitoring locally, right, our engineer verified that they were measuring for methane gas in and around the facility, and they were getting no numbers. We don't have any set up monitors. We do have stations throughout the state. Closest one is in Scranton, and Wilkes-Barre is usually related to metropolitan, population density. So, in our region, we have Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and then the Lehigh Valley. There's none of these monitors up here because the population isn't at that level. But obviously, that's something we're considering in the future, depending on, the industry growth and things like that. I think we answered most of that.
So when the system,
things that this incident brought into focus is the fact that Lathrop is a Class 1 facility, and most of our county's pipelines and compressors, however many, 20 or 21, will probably be Class 1 unless they're transmission lines. And then it's my understanding then the compressor is Class 3, but the pipelines, if it's still sparsely populated, and I think the FERC guideline is less than 10 inhabited homes for 1 mile of pipeline, 220 yards on either side of the pipeline. So what I'm getting at is it's the population density that seems to designate the level of inspection, pre-inspection, and emergency management plans. So, in Class 1 areas where most of us live in, we don't have DEP jurisdiction or PUC for any routine inspections of the pipelines. So I'm wondering who at Williams made a decision to not honor DEP's request to not start up the compressors until DEP had finished their evaluation, and also in light of a vacuum of any jurisdiction over safety for us, the stakeholders, with the pipelines in Class 1 areas. I'm wondering what Williams' routine procedures are for Class 1 areas with respect to inspecting pipelines and compressors.
Since we started the compression, and I feel like that there's going to be a lot of questions around whether it was a directive or an order. And I think in our perspective, I think what we, in the conversations that we had since, I think it's clear that the DEP, Williams should have stayed in contact with the DEP while we were doing our work over the weekend, and had more conversations. We felt like we were doing the things that we needed to do that were substantial and what the DEP had kind of requested us to do for startup, to allow us to start up. But at the end of the day, it was a discussion between me and the rest of the team out there to push forward with the startup of those units, because under the information that we had at the time, we felt like that was something that was within our ability. To your question around safety of a Group 1 or a Location 1 like that, what we do, and again, I think the way the station acted and the way it reacted to the event, we have emergency shutdown equipment, and then we rely on that equipment to maintain the kind of the protection of the station, the protection of the employees, and the protection of the communities. That system acted like it needed to act. That system responded as it needed to respond to contain the gas release. So I think we utilize those types of systems regardless of whether it's Class 1 or Class 3 to protect equipment and to protect the community.
Thank you. Let me speak. I appreciate you being here, but I don't think you can answer this question. What exactly, aside from the gas, lit off the explosion? Was it wires arcing? Was it a spark in the engine? Was it somebody's cell phone? I want to know exactly what sparked it.
Within the compressor building at the time of the maintenance, there was 6 engines running. We would have had multiple electric sources. There was laptops that were open, that were used as part of the work that was being done. So there was probably many potential ignition sources. I don't think that we'll ever know exactly which one ignited because there were so many. We have turbochargers on the engines that are at extremely hot temperatures. That's one that we think is probable source, but, you know, there's no way that we'll be able to determine the exact source, because in an operating compressor station like that, there's quite a few potential sources when you get a release of gas.
And doesn't it boil down to a lack of proper venting?
Not necessarily. You know, that a station isn't designed to have potentially releases of gas. You know, I guess there's different magnitudes of the release of the gas. And if you look at this event in particular, there would be quite a bit of rush of gas through the engine, and you know, between the release of the gas and the ignition, not a lot of time went by. So, you know, I think that in this instance, venting wasn't the issue. We have plenty of ventilation at 20% LEL. Our fans kick in at 40%. We start to do other activity. The compressor station starts to react differently. Within a very short time frame, we went from an introduction of gas to fire in this instance. So it's not just venting, I think, in this instance.
Okay.
What kind of handheld air monitors did Williams use after the fire, like the manufacturer model Montrose? And being that Williams does not monitor the air quality on a daily basis, why would they object to a citizen coming on site to test emissions at no cost to Williams?
We typically, from just a security standpoint, we maintain access control of those facilities. We do monitor the catalyst and do the quarterly testing as required by the permit.
So why would they object to me coming on board, not necessarily in the building, just coming on site with my own equipment and seeing what you got there? And can I also, and the first question too, you have the model numbers and the manufacturer of the handheld devices you use.
Which question do you want me to answer first?
The first one.
First of all, one of the priorities of us is safety, and you know, to the extent that we allow people on our facilities, you know, that's one of our first and foremost responsibilities. But you know, I think that for Williams, you know, we operate our facilities in compliance with our permits, and to the extent we do that, that's the obligation we have to the DEP. That's the obligation that we have, you know, to the communities, just to operate within the permits that we have, the operating permits that we have. You know, I don't know if anyone's ever asked us to come on, but I don't see that would be something that we would regularly do.
Thanks, Frank. Thank you.
Frank asked a question about you know, the make.
I don't know the make and models of the handheld devices.
And how can I get that?
Yeah, if you want to give us your information, definitely send me the type of model, the type of gas detector we use.
And every time I come to make a question, I'm going to ask the same question. Why can't I come on board to test the air myself?
I think he answered that, Frank. Thank you. We're going to go to some written questions.
I also think that Frank needs to get a hold of the calibration company.
Okay, you can discuss that with Frank. Yeah, you can give us the information. Thank you. There's a written question.
I was just curious, in your initial report to DEP, you said that you were going to replace the engine sometime this week, I think. Could I ask what you replaced that with?
Yeah, it's a like-kind replacement, identical.
Did you receive a new plan approval for that?
We've issued a letter as required under the permit.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Wait, sir, do you want to come and